The United States has long been a vocal critic of China's human rights record. The U.S. has supported organizations that monitor and report on abuses. However, this support has dwindled. On February 14, 2025, the U.S. government announced a freeze on funding for these groups. This decision has sent shockwaves through the human rights community. Many fear it will embolden China's crackdown on dissent. The funding freeze is part of a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy. The Trump administration has promised to put America first. It has taken a more isolationist approach to global affairs. This includes cutting back on foreign aid and reducing the U.S. role in promoting democracy and human rights abroad. The administration argues that these cuts are necessary to reduce the deficit and focus on domestic priorities. Critics of the funding freeze argue that it will have dire consequences for human rights in China. They say that it will silence important voices and make it more difficult to hold the Chinese government accountable for its actions. They also worry that it will send a signal to other authoritarian governments that the U.S. is no longer committed to promoting human rights. The funding freeze has been met with mixed reactions from the American public. Some support the administration's decision to cut back on foreign aid. They argue that the U.S. can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. Others are deeply concerned about the implications for human rights. They believe that the U.S. has a moral obligation to speak out against abuses and support those who are fighting for freedom and democracy. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, has taken on a new role in the Trump administration. As the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, Musk has been tasked with streamlining government operations and reducing spending. Musk's appointment has been met with both praise and criticism. Supporters point to his track record of innovation and success in the private sector. They believe that he will bring a fresh perspective to government. Critics, however, worry that he lacks the experience and temperament necessary for such a high-level position. One of Musk's first targets was the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED. The NED is a private, non-profit foundation that receives funding from the U.S. government. It supports democracy promotion programs around the world. Musk argued that the NED was a waste of taxpayer money and that its programs were ineffective. He gained access to the Treasury Department's payment system. With this access, he was able to halt the distribution of funds to the NED and other organizations. The decision to freeze funding for the NED has been met with condemnation from human rights groups. They argue that the NED plays a vital role in supporting democracy and human rights around the world. They point to the NED's work in countries like China, where it supports organizations that monitor human rights abuses and promote freedom of speech and assembly. They warn that defunding the NED will have a devastating impact on these organizations and will make it more difficult to promote democracy and human rights in the future. Despite the criticism, Musk has defended his decision to freeze funding for the NED. He argues that the U.S. government should not be in the business of funding foreign NGOs. He believes that these organizations should be self-sufficient and that they should be accountable to the people they serve, not to foreign governments. Musk's views on foreign aid are shared by many in the Trump administration, who believe that the U.S. should focus on its own interests and should not be obligated to help other countries. The funding freeze has had a devastating impact on human rights organizations that rely on U.S. government support. Many of these organizations have been forced to shut down or scale back their operations. This has led to layoffs and a loss of vital expertise in monitoring and reporting on human rights abuses in China. One of the hardest-hit organizations is China Labor Watch, or CLW. CLW is a small NGO that investigates labor abuses in Chinese factories that supply goods to multinational corporations. For years, CLW has played a vital role in exposing sweatshop conditions, forced labor, and other abuses in China's vast manufacturing sector. Its investigators have gone undercover in factories, interviewed workers, and published detailed reports that have led to improvements in working conditions at some factories. However, the funding freeze has forced CLW to halt most of its operations. With 90% of its $800,000 annual budget coming from U.S. government funding, CLW has had to lay off most of its staff and is facing imminent closure. The loss of CLW is a blow to efforts to improve labor conditions in China. It also sets a dangerous precedent, as other NGOs working on human rights issues in China may be forced to close their doors as well. The funding freeze has also had a significant impact on the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED. The NED is a private, non-profit foundation that receives funding from the U.S. government to support democracy promotion programs around the world. The NED has been a major supporter of human rights organizations in China, providing them with funding, training, and other forms of support. The Chinese government has long been critical of U.S. support for human rights organizations in China, viewing it as interference in its internal affairs. Chinese officials have accused the U.S. of using these organizations to promote its own values and undermine the Chinese government. They argue that China has its own path to development and that it does not need lectures from the West on human rights. The Chinese government has welcomed the funding freeze, seeing it as a vindication of its stance. State-run media has portrayed the freeze as a sign of declining U.S. influence and a retreat from global engagement. They argue that the U.S. is no longer in a position to dictate terms to other countries, and that China is emerging as a global leader in its own right. Some analysts believe that the funding freeze is part of a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy, away from promoting democracy and human rights, and towards a more transactional approach, focused on economic interests and security concerns. They argue that the Trump administration is more interested in striking deals with authoritarian leaders like Xi Jinping, even if it means overlooking human rights abuses. The funding freeze has raised concerns about the future of U.S. support for human rights around the world. It remains to be seen whether this is a temporary setback or a sign of a more permanent shift in U.S. foreign policy. However, one thing is clear: the funding freeze has had a chilling effect on human rights organizations working in China and beyond.